there's so many examples of players that they'll get their big European move, and everyone will go, oh, I know that guy from Football Manager. It's always tricky with football being such a moving target. Something will always happen. There'll always be a manager gets sacked, a day after we lock the data and the game comes out, and it's like, it's one of those annoyances. How do you compare a team in the Austrian Bundesliga to, the Championship? It's very difficult, but it can be done. If you've got a Sunderland player who's a Leicester fan, that would increase the chance in game of him wanting to sign for Leicester. In terms of the overall database, as you say, you include the support staff, analysts, so on. I think we've just gone over the 1 million people mark. Things like players' languages, so if a player comes in from abroad, doesn't speak any English, we can make sure that's recorded. And in game, you can send him on an intensive language course to make sure that he gets up to speed quickly. We would love to do it, but perhaps it would be a massive undertaking. One day, we can dream.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today's guest is Tom Elliott, who is a research coordinator for SI Games, who are the makers of Football Manager. So I know the Football Manager game is very popular within the industry, so I know a lot of my connections on LinkedIn, a lot of the viewers of this channel will have played the game, probably dedicated many hours to the game, but also they may actually be included in the game as support staff within the database of players and staff. So I think this one will resonate with a lot of people. So, in this video, I asked Tom about the collection of data, the data that's stored, and just basically just questions I was curious to ask regarding the game. So it is something a little bit different, but I think with the game being so intertwined with the industry, and that is obviously management, scouting, recruitment, etc., I thought it'd be a really interesting one to have. So without further ado, let's get into conversation with Tom. Tom, welcome to the channel. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good, and I'm quite looking forward to this one because this one is something different. So, the kind of ones that I've done so far are all kind of analysts, scouts, and stuff, and I'm always trying to think outside and think who else can I speak to. And obviously, the game of Football Manager is quite kind of popular with the people that watch his channel. So, I think having the opportunity to speak to you and ask you some questions around that, I'm really looking forward to that. So I gave a little intro, Tom, before we start, but for those that don't know who you are, if you just want to kind of give a quick overview of who you are, kind of what you're currently doing in your current role. Obviously, we'll dive deeper into that later, but just so people have a little bit of background.
Yeah, so my name is Tom Elliott. I'm a research coordinator at Sports Interactive, makers of Football Manager. I suppose if I just give you a bit of background where I sort of got here, I started off as a volunteer assistant researcher way back in 2018. I started doing the data for my team. I'm a Leicester City fan. So I did that as a volunteer role while I was at uni. Lucky enough to be offered a full-time job last year, so I've been here about 12 months now. My job in the day-to-day focuses on really looking after our head researchers. So we have head scouts who look after the data and the research for countries around the world. We've got about 90 of those. So, we'll have one for France, Spain, Italy, so on. So I look after them, all of their problems, issues, data. We make sure that they're doing a good job. So yeah, that's basically my role.
Perfect. So you mentioned there you kind of got started as a volunteer at your.
Yep.
So firstly, commiserations on Leicester going down.
Thank you.
So you'll be playing my team, which is Sunderland, playing them next season. So that should be fun. So when was that? Was that when you were at university, Tom? Like just kind of
Yep.
to go back in terms of how people get into it. So that was at uni, and you were presuming you were a fan of the game. Like, did you play the game and you just thought you want to get involved?
Yeah, so it's one of those, I played the game probably I was 14, 15 when you first pick it up, and you're obviously obsessed as everyone is. But I think at the time there was a vacancy. So every club in England will have one assistant researcher, one volunteer who's either, a supporter of the club or works in football or so on. I was lucky enough to, I applied and was lucky enough to get that. So obviously we have head researchers who will look after the English football research as a whole, but each club has their own expert who, will watch their team every week, watch the youth teams and give that kind of proper subjective opinion on their players and staff and so on.
Yeah, perfect. So then if we just kind of focus on that initial role, then the kind of volunteering. So you say every club in the country's got one of them. So there's someone watching the games so again, my team, Sunderland, so someone is there reporting on them. So what's their job? Are they going to every game, or are they just going to, like, how does that look for them, and what are they doing on an actual match day, really?
So where possible, yeah, we'd want somebody to go to every game and make sure that they're staying on top of everything to do with their club. essentially it's those people that are so obsessive that that they'll know who the next stars are in the under 18s, the under 21s, and so on. Um, but yeah, we've got a range of people. We've got some people that will work in football, some people that have actually worked for the clubs that they've researched through
Yeah,
time. But ultimately, if you're a supporter of a club and you know your team inside out, that's extremely valuable, and that's how you get into it. In terms of the day to day, mostly we those people will be expected to provide the subjective information, so the attributes, finishing, so on,
yeah,
and provide an opinion on player abilities. Um, but also it's the more objective stuff. At the end of a season, we're at the point now where we're looking at making sure we've got player appearances and goals in, achievements. Um, so you've got all of those elements that come in, and that they all have to be checked and approved by obviously our internal team, which I'm now a part of.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's very much a two-way relationship in that sense.
Yeah, perfect. So if we just focus on England, just because we could, it's obviously, I know the database is a lot bigger than that, but
Yep.
we've mentioned obviously each of the teams has one of these kind of fans or staff, and they're kind of in there. So what does the hierarchy look like then to get to? So you are your research coordinator, Tom, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does it look like, kind of feeding up, and how many are you overseeing all of those guys, or are you overseeing just the head guys, and how does that look?
Yeah, so if I just give you some numbers, we think there's just over 1,300 assistant researchers, so ones that will either do one individual club or several clubs,
Yeah,
perhaps in more smaller nations. Above them, they report into, if you like, as I say, about 80 to 90 head researchers who will cover nations as a whole. And what they'll do as well is they'll provide us things like competition rules and information about the nation as a whole to make sure we've got that information. And then they report into us. There's about a team of 15 or 20 in the internal team. Who look after and make sure that the data as a whole, there's no glaring errors, more of the, for want of a better word, the important stuff to make sure that nothing's broken. That's probably the right way of putting it.
yeah, perfect. So and then I mean, you might not have all of this information to hand, but in terms of like how many countries are covered, how many leagues, did you like, how big is this kind of network of people that are just watching football basically and getting all this data?
So we cover every country that has a FIFA affiliated football team. Yeah, so we make sure that we have all of those. So any team that has a national team, we make sure that we have national team players and so on. In
Yeah,
terms of the leagues that are playable out of the box, I think there's something like 60 and over 200 individual leagues within those 60 countries.
yeah,
So those will be researched to a more detailed degree in terms, we make sure that all the competitions are accurate. We make sure that all of the players staff are um, fleshed out to more detail. But we have information on every country. We have research that takes place in countries that aren't playable outside the box. So you can make sure that you have transfers and movements in countries that aren't necessarily leagues that you can manage in straight away.
yeah, yeah. Very, very interesting. So then, how in terms of this kind of number of the database of players and stuff, how big is this thing? So I heard, like, is it kind of hundreds of thousands of people in this database? And because again, like I mentioned to you before, actually, Tom, like a lot of people that watch this kind of podcast or are connected to me on LinkedIn, I see it all the time that they are, they're part of the game. They're an analyst. They're listed as a member of staff in the game, or they're a strength and conditioning coach. So how big is this whole list of kind of players and staff really?
So I think at last count, in terms of active players, we were at something like 480,000, so nearly at that 500,000 mark. But
Yeah,
in terms of the overall database, as you say, you include the support staff, analysts, so on. I think we've just gone over the 1 million people mark. Some of those will obviously no longer be active in football, but it just shows you the sheer size of it. And obviously, we have to keep that many people up to date, those players up to date. So it's a mammoth effort, but we manage it pretty well.
yeah. Wow. Okay. So I mean, I've got a lot of questions on the back of all that, so I'm just trying to work out which way to go for the
Go for
next
it.
thing. So, so then, what if we just talk about kind of your role then as research? What are you? So are you full time then? So you're full
I
time.
am, yeah.
So what does your average week look like, and how does that differ? Well, let's say the new games normally come out kind of November time. Is that
Yeah,
right? So
that's
how
right.
does it kind of differ for you depending on what time of the game sprint that you're at, really?
So yeah, it certainly does differ. Obviously, we released the game in November, and we'll be working to put out a database at that point. I think it's always tricky with football being such a moving target. Something will always happen. There'll always be a manager gets sacked. A day after we lock the data and the game comes out, and it's like it's one of those annoyances. But we obviously work towards the data lock in November. We work to put out some updates in January, February, March, to reflect the January window and so on. Those two are sort of the times of the year where we'll be doing a lot of work, the last minute checks and so on to make sure that everything is accurate. Obviously, at the end of a season is the point where we will review player attributes and so on, to reflect what's happened, what's changed at the end of the season. We also have the stuff, we've got to make sure that promotions, relegations are done, players have their appearances and goals up to date. So it very much follows the sort of pattern, as you can imagine, of a football season, if you like. We always have to make sure that the database is reflecting real life. So we move like that. My day to day, I suppose, fluctuates alongside that. Obviously, in the times in which we're busier in terms of getting lots of data in or making lots of changes, there'll be more pressure, more things coming in. And obviously, as we bring in new features as well, we need to make sure that they're communicated clearly to our researchers externally. So I play a role in that, and that makes sure that when we're bringing in new features that are supported by new data, we know that that data is going to be accurate across the world, really.
Yeah, sure. So where's the office for SI Games? Are you based in the office or are you remote? Like how does that work?
I'm based remotely, mostly. Our offices are down in Stratford in London, in Here East, which is in the Olympic Park.
Yeah.
So lots of us head down fairly often. But yeah, a lot of us are flexible and remote working as well. I think it works quite well with the research team. A lot of us are based remotely,
Mm.
and it gives us that um, flexibility. There's, because as I say, football is always moving. We've got a live database platform that anyone can go in and edit. At any time. It allows that kind of around the clock working that football brings, really.
Yeah, perfect. And then, so just going back to the kind of the people that are at the games, then do they have how are they submitting the data? Do you have a specific platform for that? Do they just email the head guys? Like how does that look?
Yeah, so we've got an online platform. So you'll be able to see it works very similar to Football Manager, really. There'll be a search in which you can search for your players and your team, and the attributes will come up, for example, when you're editing, a player's finishing or tackling or so on, and you can edit those and submit them, and then obviously a head researcher will have the opportunity to check those. And I think it's important that somebody couldn't just go to a game, make a Sunderland strike, 20 for finishing or whatever, and just put that through, and we wouldn't be none the wiser. So obviously we have to do those checks and make sure that nothing happens like that. But yeah, everyone can have access to all the data all the time, and we think that's important just so that people can spot errors of their own accord, and that sort of brings its value. We moved fairly recently in the last few years from it being offline, and I think that sort of had its own troubles with people only saw the final database when the game came out.
Yeah.
So for people to be able to look at other teams and say, well, I think that player is not as good as my player, I think that's really valuable. And also it allows us to connect, really, but in terms of communication, people can talk about players and data a lot easier. So it's definitely been an improvement there.
Yeah. Because that was one thing I had wrote down in terms of obviously these fans. I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but that
Yeah.
kind of putting this guy's great. He's a 20 out of 20 on finishing. So is you mentioned, like, is that just checked by someone, or is there kind of things in place? But also then what happens for potentially countries and leagues that you just don't have any stats for? Like, is there, like, do you benchmark it against the league of similar, like, again, like, because obviously there's probably things that you don't know, of course, with it being so vast.
So one of the things, just on a benchmarking point of view, that we've done is in terms of so we have a hidden attribute called current ability. It's just scored from 0 to 200, which is based on a player's attributes. And one thing that we've introduced is we take the average of the top 16 players at any club for current ability, and that gives you a number. So, for example, Manchester City could have 180 or whatever at 200. And we generate what should be suggested values for those for every club in the Premier League, in England, in the world. And what that does is allows you to, rather than plucking a number out of the sky, an arbitrary number. We have a much better benchmark in terms of comparing leagues, and we'll see that you can look into things like 538 will have their models in terms of they will rank the 500 best clubs in the world, and how do you compare a team in the Austrian Bundesliga to the championship? It's very difficult, but it can be done to some degree of accuracy. So we need to make sure that there is that level of benchmark across Europe and across the world. In terms of making sure that, as you say, those daft attributes don't go through. As I say, everything gets checked over and approved by a head researcher and often by us as well, just to make sure that you don't get those crazy examples that will get picked up by players, because ultimately the value of the data is in its accuracy. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Perfect. You actually, I swear you can see my notes here, Tom, because you just mentioned about the current ability. So I did
Yep.
read in an article. So current, again, I don't know if this is true. So is it that they have kind of two hidden parameters? So I've got down current ability and potential ability. Is that, and so that would then determine how a player may likely to be.
Exactly that, yeah. Because I mean, in terms of a benchmark to aim for. So when I get a number that say 150, I need the top 16 players at Leicester to be to average 150 for current ability.
Okay.
In terms of potential ability, that's slightly more flexible. Ultimately, it depends on a player's age, how good you think they're going to be, and just on that front, you can not only have a fixed number. So again, that's on that 0 to 200 scale. So if a player starts out at 100 for current ability, that you think that they could get to 150, that could be a fixed number. But we can also enter a range. So you'll often hear about -10 players who they, when you start the game, they'll have a chance of being between 180 or 200 potential ability, the very best.
Yeah.
And so the game will generate a number between those two values. So if you're not sure, a player's 16 and you're just not sure what direction he's going in, you can set a range to make sure that it's in the right kind of bracket, but not necessarily you're trying to predict exactly how good he's going to be.
Yeah. And then I suppose will that kind of be updated when you do up to, you say, the data lock-ins, and then you do an update after the January transfer window? And is that how often you would update in terms of the database? Is it like November, or well, before the launches and then after the window?
Yeah, so mostly it would be 2 a year. Obviously, we have to be reactive to certain things. So, for example, when Chinese transfer window, for example, got moved a couple of months, we had to make sure that we included that. So there can be several updates, but mostly we aim for 2 a year. And that can bring its challenges. A player could, so much happens in 6 months in football. A player could completely explode from nowhere. But by the same token, you don't want to be reacting to, a player who comes in and scores off the bench 1 week and you think, he's the second coming of Lionel Messi, only to realize that, he's actually not that good the next week. So it sort of brings everything into focus to only do it twice a year.
Yeah, sure. And okay, so so you've mentioned, I think you've already answered this in terms of is there any leagues that are not covered that you need to start covering? I know you mentioned you kind of do every FIFA affiliated league, but like, what, in terms of expanding to the really obscure places, is that something that you would do? Like, how, and if so, like, is there any on the where would be next potentially?
I think it's obviously one that's bound by resources and licensing in terms of what can we get, but also how cost effective something is. Would it be sensible to bring in the Northern Mariana Islands or whatever? How many people are going to play in those divisions? So we look at those in terms of a business perspective, really. But the data is there. We have, as I say, at the very least, we would have all of the players playing international football for those nations. So, and all of the clubs in top divisions will be there. So if one day that you could play in any nation, that would definitely be possible. I think that there's lots of nations that we would one day like to have. But yeah, there's restrictions in terms of what we can and can't do. And of course, the big one is that if we have 60 nations, 200 leagues, competitions, we go all the way down. If we're looking at nations like Latvia and Slovakia, we're going right the way down to their under 19 competitions. We need to make sure that all of those rules are correct. That's a huge undertaking, not just the data itself, but making sure that the competitions are accurate as well. Whether it's number of substitutions or financial fair play, all of these things have to be right. So it's one of those where we would love to do it, but perhaps it would be a massive undertaking. One day we can dream.
Definitely. So, and then because I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't played the most recent ones in terms of that. I mean, I wish I had the time to do that, but I think one thing that kind of when Football Manager is mentioned is it's almost like everyone that plays it is very passionate about it, and they're very well. Almost you could say that they're addicted. Like they spend a lot of time on it because it's such a good game, and obviously that the fact that it's getting more and more realistic over time is obviously even better. So the stuff in terms of like the players, obviously the attributes. So we know like the passing, shooting, and stuff. But then is there additional information on there that is recorded? Because again, something else I read was, are you? Let's say I'm a researcher for Sunderland and I find out something on a certain player that they I don't know, their favorite team is Leicester, for example, or they've had, they come from a different country, they've got like a second descent from the Philippines or something like that. So would that be included in that? Would that be factored in to the actual game as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we record players likes, who they like clubs are, dislike clubs. So, that increases the chance, for example, as you say, if you've got a Sunderland player who's a Leicester fan, that would increase the chance in game of him wanting to sign for Leicester. Also, people liked people. So we make sure that for example, there's a relationship between a father and son if that happens in game. So the father will be more likely to sign the son. So all of those things are recorded. As you say, nationalities are there. So if you've got a player who's 19 who's eligible for 3 or 4 nations, you can make sure that those are all in there. And then if you're an international manager, you've got the chance to call up that player if he's eligible. Things like players' languages. So if a player comes in from abroad, doesn't speak any English, we can make sure that's recorded. And in game, you can send him on an intensive language course to make sure that he gets up to speed quickly. So all of these things have to be factored in on a realism point, but it does go so much into detail. There's so much. I mean, you get so much value out of those match day program interviews where players will go, this is my favorite teammate, and this is my favorite X, Y, and Z, and all of those things can go in because it's valuable information and it will affect the simulation.
Yeah.
So we really do go to a granular level.
That's crazy. I don't know. Again, you might not be able to say whether this is true or not, but I did read that Brereton Diaz was called up for Chile because of that. Is that all? Do we know? Have you heard that before? Is that even true? So about his obviously Chilean descent. So what can you say about
Think it is true. Yeah,
that?
I'm fairly sure that was one that was picked up. Might have been in a program or an interview that Brereton Diaz did. That we picked up on. It was added as his second nationality, and obviously that data exists, and a national team could use it. And if you pick up on the fact that there's a player who's eligible for Chile, then that could happen. I think we've had 1 or 2 other stories quite like that.
Hmm.
You know, that information probably isn't easily accessible. There's lots of other databases out there that will, record player nationalities just in the same way. But if it's sort of just been done in a small little interview somewhere, and somebody's taken the time to watch it, and we've recorded it first, that's immensely valuable. And what a story it's been for him.
Yeah.
I think is he going to Villarreal? Is he? It's completely exploded from nowhere. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those slightly surreal stories, but certainly a good one.
Yeah, perfect. Just for that, I mean, the majority of the listeners will know that, but just for those that don't, obviously, played for, I think he's from Stoke. Is he born in Stoke? The player plays for obviously Blackburn. So he found out they had the descended from Chile, and obviously then qualified and plays for the international team. And as you said, kind of maybe potentially go into Villarreal or whatever. So yeah, and you said there's been a couple more of them. Sorry, so that's that's quite cool to hear. So in terms of them, would the because I remember, and this is going back a long time. This is going back to when I was at school. So there was, and it links back to the kind of potential ability kind of stat that you had on there. Because there was when we were at school and we were all kind of playing it as you probably did yourself, if your mates are on there. The names of these random people just get floated about. It's like you need to sign this guy from wherever. Like this, in 10 years he becomes amazing. Like, are they kind of like, would an insider, would you guys know who is going to be that kind of next wonder kid? Because I remember, and again, he's probably not watching, but there's one of my friends at the time was Dean, and he used to play. He gave his life to the game. He played so much, and he'd sign these players, and we're like, where did you even find this guy? But he's like, winning the Champions League with like Maidstone or something. So he's got these players. So in terms of those wonder kids, can you share anything on them? And would you guys know who is gonna, or is that does their probability of becoming the next big thing get updated, like we said, after each update and data locking and stuff?
Yeah, so pretty much exactly that. I mean, we're not going to be at a point where we're watching them on the park. We're not going to be discovering them before the clubs. But when a player gets to 16, 17 and they're at a professional club, they end up in our database. We'll be aware, we'll be watching them at that level and making sure that, I think cumulatively and individually, we've got good football knowledge. So we can pick out a good young player.
Yeah.
So, the example that classic example is Erling Haaland. Everyone who played FM, sort of FM 17, knew that when he was 16 at Mulder, he was going to be he was, you sign him on the cheap. He's the next big thing. And that was because he was rated, well in the game for a 16-year-old. He had, as you say, a high potential ability.
Mm.
And that sort of carried through and that one has come off. They don't all come off, the Freddie Adus of this world and so on. Some players just don't make it, but we've got a pretty good track record. There's so many examples of players that they'll get their big European move, and everyone will go, oh, I know that guy from Football Manager, because we do just have that knowledge of those young players that will just be ready to explode on the scene. I remember just on a Leicester example, Luke Thomas coming through in the under-18s at 16, 17. I had an eye for him. He was the outstanding player in that crop of players. So, you give him a high potential ability right the way, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that one comes off, but then others don't. But we've got a pretty good track record. But yeah, we're not scouts in the sense of, we pick these players up before anyone else does,
Yeah.
but we do sort of we do have that record of knowing when a player is going to be
Yeah.
a top player.
Yeah, sure. So, and have you added women's football to the recent one? Is that a new thing just in the last game, or?
It's not yet, but it's certainly something that we'd like to do in the near future. I think there was a blog post on our website about the ambitions, but of course, women's football, there's a lot of similarities with men's football, but there's also a lot of differences. And I think that we need to make sure that if we want to be the most accurate simulation of women's football, we need to make sure that we do that properly and take our time with it. And obviously, we're lucky enough to have so many contacts in the game who can sort of advise us on some of those differences and make sure that we do that. But definitely a work in progress, but not something that we've got in yet. No.
Okay, perfect. So, just going back to like the game being used by clubs and managers and scouts and things like that. So, firstly, just a quick one: have you ever had kind of players complaining about their stats, like they should be rated higher for certain things? Is that ever a thing? Have you ever had that?
Yeah, we have that. I think that's sometimes perfectly fair. I remember we did a promotional video with Jose Perez at Leicester, and he was like, "Well, I think my dribbling could be a few points higher," and so on. So you get these. Everyone's got an opinion about it, and it's I suppose it's good publicity for us, but also it's a fair assessment from a player of what they think their strengths and weaknesses are. But we're the ones watching them, and we like to think that we're fairly unbiased in comparison to them. But yeah, we there's a few that will yeah, be a little bit miffed if they don't think they're rated as high as they should be.
Yeah, sure. So, because if we just go now to kind of the again down to that aspect of how realistic the game is. So, because I've seen on LinkedIn and stuff like Miles postings where he, and these aren't shared publicly, but he will like speak to clubs, that speak to these heads of recruitment, managers and stuff in professional clubs, to potentially then hear how they are working, how that role looks, so then you can obviously then implement that into the game. So can you talk a little bit about that, Tom, and how those kind of things are used to improve the game?
Yeah, so we're really lucky to have those. We call them foot talks. So people will come in and give us a Q&A session. Loads of people in football, as you say, not just managers, but people in recruitment, people in academies, and so on. And what that allows us to do is, we get to ask them questions about not only their career, but also their day to day and how their jobs actually work. And ultimately, Football Manager is a management and football simulation. And the more realistic we make it from what they tell us, the better. I think the other thing that's good is because they're behind closed doors, they're internal only for everyone at SI. Those people feel a lot more comfortable sort of sharing a little bit more detail. So, it's not like a generic Q&A or a press conference where somebody would sort of be a little bit on guard as to what they say. If a manager comes in and is prepared to do a tactical breakdown with their tactics board and whatever, that's extremely valuable for us, but they probably wouldn't be that comfortable doing it in public because, they'd be sharing their tactical secrets. So, it's it's immensely valuable, and a lot of things that we've put into the game or would like to are sort of influenced by that. Um, yeah, there I don't think I've got too much more to say on that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it is an important, especially the fact that they are behind closed doors as well, because we know how secretive clubs can be, and they're not going to say, they can definitely be a lot more honest if they know that it is just internally for you guys, and it just further adds to that realisticness of the game. Because on that point, because I've seen a blog post on your website basically in terms of some of the stats that are used in game now, which I had no idea you were using. So like I've just got it open here, so I'll just jump over so I'm not making something up here. So in terms of in the game, so you've got the attributes of the players and stuff, but then you are using things like shots per 90, expected goals, expected assists, and things like that are like these modern data terms that are used. So they are in the game and they are kind of always getting updated.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, football data and those terms are becoming more common knowledge. Expected goals, for example, has exploded of late, but we've always had that kind of data there. Obviously, the match engine will produce that data for us, and so we want to be able to reflect what real life would be. Any football fan with real life football can go on FBref or any of these websites and find all of these statistics on, progressive carries or whatever it might be. And so if that's the case for the fan, what are the clubs getting access to? So in game, we have the data hub, which, presents all of those statistics in, we've got the visualizations there, just like, you would have with performance analysts and data scientists and so on. And that data's there for the player to use in the way that they want to, the way that a manager or a recruitment team would. You want to make sure that not just you're looking at the attributes, which obviously don't exist in real life, but you're also, you want to be recruiting players in game based on, who's top of the leaderboards in terms of, who's got the most tackles, who's doing X, Y, and Z per 90. So, yeah, that's there, and we think it's a really really valuable part of the game.
Yeah. And this might be a stupid question, Tom, but
Go for it. Go for it.
so I'm just curious to know how real life meets the simulations. Obviously, you're putting obviously these attributes and stats are, I know they're the opinion of the researcher, but they are, they're on real players. But then when you're in the game and you're playing the game, if I'm managing Sunderland, obviously there's all the simulations of all the other fixtures, because obviously other people are transferring across. So how do them two kind of worlds meet really in terms of the simulation and the real when it comes to updating the database?
So you mean in terms of so when you start a game, you start your game in June 2023 or whatever, you'll
Yeah.
have obviously things as they were when that database was, and then the
Yeah.
game sort of simulates from there. Is that
Yeah, so like if I'm the manager of Sunderland, obviously what the transfers that are happening in the Italian league while I'm
yeah,
managing Sunderland, so that because that would then influence who I can buy and if I'm buying
sure.
someone else. So yeah, that's what I meant. I explained it probably terribly, but go for
No, no, not at all.
it.
So yeah, that's it simulated via the code. So all of those things that everything that's set in the database in the code in terms of, what's an Italian who's an Italian club likely to sign, who are they going to go after. So and all of that logic is there. If Juventus need a left back, they will go out and sign a left back. All of that is in there to make sure that that's happening, and it's all happening in the background. So you feel immersed. So you'll get the news item saying, Bayern Munich have signed X, Y, and Z player. It's to make sure that it's an immersive world, so that and as you say, the games are going on as well, so they'll be simulated in the background too. So you can go and click and watch the highlights of another match in another league, which is quite remarkable, really. But it does happen, and again, that's all using the same data, and the data obviously changes. Players will develop or decline and so on. So as you move on through the years, and as you say, transfers happen, the game develops its own world, and no two games are ever the same. Just as two real world simulations would be the same, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. That's interesting. So then, and again, I'm presuming this just kind of goes on for because the next question I had was in terms of, are you aware of kind of the like longest games that people have? Because again, going back to the chap I was friends with at school, Dean, he was notorious for this. This is probably what 18 years ago or so, when he was, Theo Walcott had come through, but he'd already retired in his game. So, how kind of future proof is this? Is it just kind of going to go forever? And are you able to? Do you even know like what the longest games are that people have actually potentially had?
Yeah, I think we had a record of something like 500 seasons into the future. You know, that's just a game that somebody's actually sat and played and gone through every season. But I suppose you could simulate all the way through. You send your manager on holiday and you go for thousands of years or whatever. Um, but yeah, it's funny you see these fantasy things. How many league titles have X, Y, and Z won in 100 years?
Mm,
And there's all sorts of things like that. And we've got an editor that allows you to do those things and do silly scenarios like what would Man City be like in the National League or so on.
yeah.
So yeah, I think 500 seasons is about right. It's something like if you're putting in tens of thousands of hours at that point, you couldn't just do it in 1 year, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So if someone wants to kind of get into being a researcher, then whether it be obviously maybe starting off in that kind of volunteer at the local, how do they do that? Are there any kind of spots available in England at the minute, or just if you want to share a bit on that, Tom?
Yeah, so there's a sub forum on our community.sigames.com forum. All of the listed by countries. There's threads with updated vacancies for all of the clubs and leagues that we cover. Or you could send us an email and we'd be happy to consider that. Obviously, it's always moving. People leave and rejoin. So I'd recommend dropping in and dropping out if you would like to cover the research or be interested in covering research for your club. But yeah, we're always looking for more help, always looking for more knowledge. The data is always moving. So yeah, our forums is the place to go.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I'll link that
Thank
in
you.
the description below. I'll obviously link to the website and the blog and stuff. So, perfect. Is there anything else you wanna add, Tom? Anything you wanna honestly just anything at all that maybe missed out? Because I know we've been jumping around different bits there. I'm just curious to ask so many things, but anything that you want to add, feel free, Tom.
It's a bit of an open-ended question, but yeah, it's just it's an immense pleasure to cover the data. I think the data that we've got, I think we consider ourselves probably the biggest football database that exists. It's the data that we have is extremely valuable and accurate, and I think it's one of those things that every year people want to buy our game because they want to play with all of the new squads and so on. And it's a really joyful thing, to cover football around the world and talk to people that, some people that work in the game and professional scouts and so on, and interact with those people and talk football and see what their opinions are of players that, that differ or are similar. An amazing thing and a privilege to do. Um, and yeah, I think we're really proud. It's one of those. I think I saw a quote. It's our golden egg, the database.
Yeah,
It's that thing that we've got that a lot of others wouldn't. So yeah, it's privilege.
yeah. I think it's really cool that you do include obviously the all of the support staff as well. I don't know if that has always been. Has that kind of just do you add more than that over time? Because I don't know if that was a thing when I used to, the analyst was on there, or is that kind of something that's developed over time?
Yeah, so we've added sort of new job roles. I think remember that, as you say, analyst, sports scientist was a slightly recent one, but yeah, we're always looking to add support staff. And as you say, you'll get those LinkedIn posts of people that are so thrilled to be added to the game.
Mm.
And obviously we need to make sure that those are accurate, and clubs aren't often so good at making sure that their staff lists on their websites are that detailed. So LinkedIn can be really valuable. But yeah, it's you want to make sure that you've got all of those people in. So when a player gets injured, you get an email from your physio and it's the right guy,
Yeah.
Uh, it's that level of detail, that level of simulation, and yeah,
Yeah, perfect, perfect. Well, I've gone through pretty much everything I wanted to speak with you, Tom. So again, I just want to say thanks
awesome.
for taking the time out. Obviously, lots of hours have been given up to this game by a lot of the viewers. So again, I'll link a few I'll link a few bits and pieces below. If anyone's got any questions,
Thank
obviously
you.
leave a comment underneath the video. But yeah, Tom, thanks very much for your time, and I'll catch up with you soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Tom.